At a bustling international airport filled with announcements, dragging suitcases and rushing footsteps, an elderly woman in her late 70s slowly made her way toward the boarding gate. Her steps were cautious, almost fragile, as she clutched a faded cloth bag in one hand and an economy-class boarding pass in the other. Her clothes were clean but worn, a pale blue sweater stretched at the sleeves, an old floral scarf loosely tied around her neck. Yet, in the midst of all this noise and speed, her eyes held a soft, unshakable dignity, as though she carried more grace than anyone else in that terminal. Passengers rushed past her, barely noticing her presence. She was invisible in a world obsessed with haste. When she finally reached the plane's entrance, she paused and looked up at the young flight attendant standing at the door. In a soft, trembling voice, she asked, "Would it be possible if there's space to sit in the front? I get dizzy in the back." The flight attendant, without even looking her in the eye, offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach her voice. "Ma'am, those are first-class seats. You'll need to go to your assigned seat at the back." There was no empathy, no consideration, just protocol. The old woman nodded slowly, murmured a thank you, and began her long walk down the narrow aisle, clutching her bag a little tighter. As the elderly woman turned away from the first-class section, her shoulders slightly slumped from the quiet rejection. A well-dressed businessman, lounging comfortably in seat 1A, let out a scoff. Without looking at her, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough to be heard, "This isn't a bus stop." His words sliced through the air like a paper cut. A couple of nearby passengers chuckled, not loudly, but just enough to sting. None of them knew her name. None cared to ask. She didn't react. Her back straightened just a little, her grip on the cloth bag tightened, and she continued walking slowly down the aisle, past the plush seats, toward the cramped rows in economy, each step echoing with quiet resilience. A few rows back, a small boy sitting by the window watched everything unfold with wide, curious eyes. He tugged gently at his mother's sleeve, leaning in to whisper, "Why are they being mean to her?" The mother, watching too, placed a hand over his and replied softly, "Sometimes people forget what kindness means." Her words hung in the air, a quiet truth in the middle of luxury and indifference. The boy continued watching the old woman as she shuffled to her seat, the only one not looking away. In a world filled with rushing adults and cold comforts, it was the innocence of a child that saw the truth most clearly. Seated near the very back of the plane, the old woman settled into her narrow economy seat with a quiet sigh. The hum of the cabin filled the air as passengers continued to board. She pulled out a worn handkerchief and coughed gently into it, her breath slightly labored, her body tired from the long wait. Her eyes, though still alert, now looked slightly disoriented as she turned her gaze to the small window beside her, watching the workers outside load luggage with mechanical rhythm. The noise, the crowd, the indifference, it all weighed on her frail frame. Across the aisle, a young woman noticed her discomfort. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and offered the old woman a bottle of water. The gesture was simple, but the gratitude in the old woman's eyes was profound. She smiled, nodding a silent thank you, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the bottle. Meanwhile, in the spacious first-class cabin, the mood was quite different. Murmurs drifted through the aisles, some snide, others indifferent. "Can we just go already?" one man groaned. Another shook his head, scrolling on his phone. Word of the earlier interaction had reached the cockpit. One of the crew members quietly informed the pilot of the small delay caused by the elderly woman's request. As the pilot prepared for takeoff, his hand hesitated over the throttle. Something about the situation stuck with him. Lifting the intercom mic, he asked in a steady voice, "Which passenger needed help again?" The question caught the crew off guard, because it wasn't routine. And something in the pilot's tone hinted that he wasn't just asking for protocol.
Just as the plane began to taxi onto the runway, a soft chime ran through the cabin, followed by the familiar crackle of the intercom. The passengers, half-buckled and distracted by phones or conversations, paused. The pilot's calm, steady voice came through, Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we take off today, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone very special who's traveling with us. A hush settled over the plane as curious glances were exchanged. Even those in first class, previously indifferent, looked up from their tablets and newspapers. The voice continued, now laced with emotion. There is a woman on board whose story I carry with me every time I fly. Someone who made an impact on my life when I was at my lowest. A few eyebrows raised. The pilot took a deep breath. Her name is Mrs. Rosa Holloway. Years ago, when I was a homeless teenage boy with nowhere to go, she found me sitting outside a diner in the freezing cold. She didn't know my name or my story, but she gave me a warm meal, an old winter coat, and a place to sleep on her porch. Just one night, but that one night changed everything. Gasps could be heard. Passengers turned to look around. The atmosphere shifted. I never forgot her, the pilot said softly. And now, fate has given me a chance to say thank you up here, in the skies she helped me reach.
A stunned silence washed over the entire cabin like a wave. The hum of idle conversation and the rustling of newspapers came to a halt. Passengers sat frozen, processing the pilot's words. Slowly, heads began to turn, eyes scanning the rows to find the woman who had unknowingly changed a life. There was no spotlight, no applause, just quiet awe and curiosity rippling through the plane. Near the rear of the aircraft, Mrs. Rosa Holloway sat motionless, confused. Her weathered hands still held the bottle of water the young woman had given her. She looked around, uncertain if she had heard correctly. Then a flight attendant appeared beside her, eyes wide, breath quick, and knelt down beside her seat. She leaned in and whispered something gently into Rosa's ear. Rosa blinked in disbelief. "Me," she whispered. A few rows up, the well-dressed businessman who had scoffed at her earlier shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat. He adjusted his tie, suddenly aware of the eyes near him. His smirk was long gone, replaced by shame as realization dawned. He had mocked someone who once saved a life. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice returned, quieter but firm, full of gratitude. "If she hadn't helped me when she did, I might not be here. Today, it's my turn to return that kindness." The entire aircraft seemed to breathe in at once, the air now heavy with something deeper than altitude, humility. Moments later, the cockpit door slowly opened, and the pilot stepped into the cabin, still in uniform, his hat tucked respectfully under one arm. The passengers turned in surprise. It was rare to see a captain leave the cockpit before takeoff, but what followed was even more unexpected. With steady steps, he began walking down the narrow aisle, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Mrs. Holloway. She looked up, startled, still unsure of what was happening. But when their eyes met, something sparked, a distant, almost forgotten memory. The pilot knelt beside her, gently taking her hand in both of his. His voice cracked with emotion. "You saved my life," he whispered, tears brimming. "You didn't know me, but you saw me. You fed me. You covered me with a blanket when no one else would. Please let me give something back." The cabin was absolutely silent as he helped her to her feet. She moved slowly, leaning on him, but the strength in her presence filled the space. Together, arm in arm, they walked back up the aisle. This time, no one looked away. Some passengers wiped their eyes discreetly. Others bowed their heads, ashamed of their earlier laughter, of their silence. And then one person began to clap. Another joined. Soon, soft applause filled the cabin, not loud or performative, but sincere. A tribute, a thank you. As the pilot guided her into a first-class seat, it wasn't just an upgrade in class, it was the return of dignity that had always been hers. As Mrs. Holloway gently lowered herself into the plush first-class seat, her fingers trembling slightly. The pilot remained by her side. The cabin had quieted again, the atmosphere reverent. He knelt beside her one last time, his eyes filled with the weight of gratitude. "Everything I have," he said softly. "Every mile I've flown. Every dream I've lived. It all started with your kindness." From his coat, he pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box and placed it carefully in her lap. Her hands hovered over it for a moment before she slowly untied the ribbon. Inside was a folded letter, written in the captain's own hand, along with a polished voucher on official airline stationery. He smiled gently and said, "It's a lifetime pass for you. Anywhere in the world, anytime. No questions asked. You fly like royalty." Tears welled in her eyes, words caught in her throat. She clutched his hand tightly, overwhelmed and speechless. Around her, passengers watched with softened hearts, many wiping away tears of their own. The young woman across the aisle smiled warmly. And in first class, the same businessman who had ridiculed her earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced by quiet shame. Without a word, he looked away, knowing he had witnessed something far greater than luxury, the enduring legacy of compassion. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft gently lifted off the tarmac, a sense of stillness settled over the passengers. No one spoke. The earlier rush and chatter had faded into reverent silence. Outside, clouds swirled like soft blankets over the earth, and sunlight began to break through, casting a warm golden hue across the cabin. Then, the intercom crackled one final time. The pilot's voice returned, steady and filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we ascend, I ask you to remember something. Never underestimate the power of a kind act. One warm meal, one small gesture, can lift someone into the skies." The words hung in the air like a quiet benediction, echoing in every heart on board. Mrs. Holloway sat by the window, her fingers gently resting on the edge of the small box still in her lap. The wind, filtered through the cabin's gentle hum, played with the ends of her silver hair as she gazed out over the horizon. Her eyes shimmered, not just from the sunlight but from the memories, the meaning, the moment. Around her, passengers reflected silently. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared out the window, humbled. The businessman who had mocked her sat with folded hands, lips pressed together, visibly changed. In that moment, 30,000 feet above the world, everyone on that plane knew they had witnessed something far greater than a flight. They had witnessed humanity at its best.